Director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, and I want to welcome everybody to the webinar on border carbon adjustment in the EU. This is it's an open meeting, it's not under Chatham House rules. And we have a significant number of people, and as a result of this, we will have to wait for a few minutes. In principle, and I'm not sure this is the right thing to do or not, but in principle, there's 750 people registered. But I always look at the rule of thumb in Brussels, which is rarely wrong, which is about 66%. But we shall see, and I think just we'll need to give people a little bit of time to register. But in any case, it is border carbon adjustment, the EU. I want to thank the speaker who are joining us today. We have been waiting, as you will know, we have been waiting for a long time for this moment. I think we have been pontificating and kibitzing and leaking and whatever else possible under the sun we've been doing over the last 18 months, for whenever this thing first came on the radar. And kind of the moment of truth came last week that we actually faced the real McCoy, the real proposal. And now it's up to all of us, starting with Vicente Hurtado Roa, who's the head of unit in DG TaxSud, that is shepherding this file, to give us the details and things that hopefully a few things that are maybe not completely written down. And then what we have a very interesting panel. We have tried to get a panel of people that represent very different views in such a way that as we are the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, we do get a very broad set of views. So first of all, we'll have my colleagues, Aaron Cosby and Michael Melling, that we have worked together on this project now for, I think, the longest of 12 to 18 months. I'm losing track. It almost sounds forever. And I will want to thank them very much. It's been a fabulous collaboration. Then we have Peter Gogvidasmani from Singapore for the Ministry of Trade. Peter is an old hand at trade negotiation, WTO, UNFCCC. So he has been involved in this for a long time. Welcome, Peter, from Singapore. It's not that late in Singapore for the moment. Susanna Droge from SWP. I always resist saying in the long German name. I've seen Susanna will probably correct me at some point, so I prefer not to do it. But I know that a think tank of a German parliament. And then Koen Koppenhol, who's the president, who's the president of CBAM, the Association of Cement Producers in Europe. Also, David Kleinman from Georgetown University. David Banks from the Bipartisan Policy Center had to excuse himself very early this morning for an emergency. We appreciate the effort, and we understand these things happen sometime. And David has graciously stepped in, and for that I'm very grateful. I think I know what it means. I try not to put people in that position, but we very much appreciate that David stepped in at this very last moment. So as for what I would like to do is first of all just recap the fact that we've been through a whole set of things together. We have been through the impact assessment, the inception impact assessment. We have been through the consultation. We have been through looking at leaks. We have been through ERC's town halls and many other colleagues and institutions that have participated in this. So it is not something that has not been discussed in Brussels circles for the last 12 to 18 months. It's been almost beaten to death, if you want. Probably Vicente, when you got this file, I'm not sure that you realize how popular you are going to be as a speaker on everybody's radar. I have to confess that we had not dealt with DG TaxSud before, because our more natural environment is DG Klima, and I was kind of scared. Because instead of the tax people, they talk to anybody or what they do. So I have to also say that both you and Gerasimos and your colleagues have been very gracious with us, and I'm sure with many other of our colleagues in discussing and listening to the event. So now it's up to me to hand over this to you, Vicente, and give you the envelope. And you open the envelope, you tell us what's inside. We've read it, but nevertheless, let's assume that we're listening now with the first time.
Thank you, Andre. Good afternoon, everyone, first of all, and good afternoon also to my colleagues in the panel today. I mean, you said it before. I mean, it's been a long road to get here. We have been spending hours and hours and hours. I hope you said that you got scared when you knew it was going to be taxed piloting this. I hope you changed your mind.
Totally.
I have to admit that it was a great honor for me also to pilot this project. And I feel a bit like the mother who has delivered the baby. Now we all have to take care of the baby. But also listening to you, I have the impression that there were most expectancies sometimes on the other side than on our side. I hope we will not disappoint anyone. But at least now we have a proposal on the table and we can discuss around the proposal. And as I said before, it's a bit the baby of all of us. And I think it's also our duty to make sure that this will come into effect as best as possible. Many things have been said so far in the preparation of the delivery. I think we discussed a lot about objectives, the design, possible designs of the measure, about, of course, all the principles around like WTO compliance, like Paris Agreement, free trade agreements. I mean, I think we don't need to insist on all that. And maybe the best is that I concentrate today on the main features of the final proposal, not of the leaked version. If you have read the leaked version, you will see that there have been some changes. That was a very, very premature version. And I think the best is that we concentrate to do on the main lines. Maybe I will provide a more helicopter view, but I think that through the questions and the discussion in the panel, we will be able to go more into the details. But I'm sure we will have plenty of time in the coming months to go through all the details. As you will see, those of you who have not read the proposal yet, there is a lot of space for many implementing the delegated acts because we need the time to go into those details. But I think the discussions will allow us to also pencil down and well to give a good support for the preparation of those proposals. Okay, my question now is whether you can see my screen.
We are
Yes.
seeing the screen, yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. So we are talking about carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's correct. That's good. Okay, I said before about the objectives. I'm not going to repeat them, but I'm going to insist that, of course, it hasn't changed along all this period. The main objective, of course, is to improve the fight against climate change, either in the EU, because this is linked, and I will come back to that again, to, of course, the review of the ETS, and you will have to read our regulation on the CBAM in parallel to the review of the ETS, and I will give you some clues, but also because it will have an impact on the behavior of third country producers. We want to make a difference with the CBAM. I think we can already see some signals. Many countries have been interested in the measure, of course, first of all, because they are going to be impacted and they want to understand in which way or another there will be an impact on their industry, but then also because they are interested in the measure, because they want to introduce also carbon pricing measures or other regulatory measures in their countries. And of course, they are interested in avoiding the carbon leakage risk. So for them, the CBAM, and I hope the CBAM can be not only an EU measure, but can also be a reference for their policy, for their climate policy in their countries, and also for the introduction of other carbon border adjustment measures. We announced that the measure will generate revenues and that the revenues could become a possible new EU own resource. This has not been adopted for the moment, but that's in the pipeline. I want to clarify with respect to that what I have said many times. The objective, of course, is not a budgetary impact, a budgetary objective at all. I can tell you that if you look at the figures and you will see in the impact assessment, you will see figures around 9 billion euros, etc. Of course, many all that will depend on the year when you apply the CBAM, because as we will see later on, there will be a gradual introduction. But I can tell you that most of the revenues will not come from the CBAM itself, and that will depend also on the reaction in third countries, but they will come from the fact that we are getting rid along the time of the free allowances. And as you know, one possible new on resource will also be the ETS. I get very often the question about the recycling of revenues, and I want to say that now because I tend to forget, and I think it's very important for the industry. The CBAM revenues in that case could be part of the EU budget. As part of the EU budget, our intention, of course, is to invest those monies back into the real economy. For that reasons, we have also, as part of the Fit for 55 package adopted last 14th of July, we have also proposed a new social climate fund that will channel part of the revenues from the extension of the ETS also to transport and buildings. And also, as you know, we have a just transition fund, and we have other funds that intend to support the decarbonization efforts of the economy. But, and then I said before, you need to read in parallel to this regulation also the ETS review. You will find hooks, or you will find references to the innovation fund. The idea is the more revenues, in particular from the free allowances that will disappear, will go into the innovation fund, and that the funds from the innovation fund will be used for all the sectors, but in particular there will be a special treatment for example, the maritime sector that will be included in the ETS, but also for the CBAM sectors. I'm afraid that we cannot do any sort of earmarking, but what I can tell you, and this is already in the proposal, in the directive, is that we want to support the CBAM sectors to decarbonize, because we think that this is also very, very important. So revenues, not so much as an objective, but as a complementary element to the system in order to support the decarbonization efforts. As part of the EU budget, of course, we can also support, and we already do that, third countries, in particular the less developed countries, in order to be able to introduce measures, not only to deal with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also to introduce effective measures to decarbonize. We know that they need this support. This support is, of course, important for us. And of course, the CBAM revenues, in one way or another, will be able also to be channeled and support those efforts. The key elements of the design, very quickly, as you know, we are mirroring the EU ETS. So you will see in the proposal that we try to be as loyal or as close as possible to how the ETS is working in the EU, because we wanted to give the same treatment, the same the same sort of implementation also to importers into the EU. Some will criticize that this adds a complexity. Some will say we don't need such complexity to do that, but we thought that the best way to do it, also in order to ensure full compliance, non-discrimination, and full compliance with the WTO, which is one of the main elements of the design or guiding elements of the design, we thought that we had to be as close as possible to the ETS. Of course, there will be differences because, as you know, the ETS applies to installations, while the CBAM necessarily has to apply to goods, to the importation of goods. So because of that, and because of the fact that an ETS introduces a cap and we cannot introduce a cap for imports because that could be seen as a trade restriction, then there will be some differences in the system. But in general, I would say that we have tried to be as close as possible to the ETS. Of course, the focus is on carbon-intensive sectors which are at risk of carbon leakage. And we see the CBAM as a complementary measure because of the interaction with the free allowances, in particular, to the EU emission trading system review in this case. Okay, sorry. So next slide. The basic concepts, the idea is that the obligations will fall on the importer. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Coming from TaxSud, Andre, and you will recognize that. That's an advantage. We know how the customs work. We know they have been working for a long time. The customs union was one of the main achievements of the European Union when the European Union was not as such. And it has been working quite well. We have robust procedures, and we want to rely on them as much as possible. So this is why we want to target the importers. They will be the ones who will provide information, who will be obliged to do all the necessary implementing obligations, and they are the ones that we know the better. So there will be also reassurance that the CBAM will be working, and also, of course, that the system will be effective. Then, of course, we want to take into account, as you know, free actual emissions embedded in the imports of the goods, and we also want to take into account the carbon price paid at the source. This is important to mirror the ETS, of course, but also it's important to ensure that there won't be any discrimination of importers. And then the CBAM will be charged and adjusted, or the charge will be adjusted in order to reflect also the review of the ETS. And I will come back to that when I explain a bit better the final regime from 2026. So a gradual phase in, you saw that, you discovered that with first a transitional period of 3 years, and then the full CBAM from 2026. In terms of sectors, nothing surprising to you. Cement, iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity. Let me underline that we are not talking about full sectors. We are talking about goods from these sectors. And you have the full list of goods in the annex 1. We have been listening to the industry. I hope we made it right. We got it right with the list, and you can find all the different goods listed according to their CN codes in the annex 1 of the regulation. Sorry. The sectors have been risked on the basis of 3 criteria. You know all that, so I don't think I have to insist on that. That's for the first stage from 2023 in terms of collecting information, from 2026 in application of a full CBAM, but the intention is to have a review of the proposal already in 2025, so at the end of the transitional period, on the basis of the data that will be collecting by them. And I cannot exclude that there will be an extension also to other sectors already from 2026. So I think that the next month, next years will be important in order to calibrate the sectors. As you know, some of the sectors that according to the criteria that qualified quite well to be included in the list. I'm thinking about some chemicals like the polymers, or for example, refineries. There were some technical issues with them. That was one of the reasons, but not the only one. But for example, we have problems to allocate emissions to the goods because the emissions are assessed or calculated on a global basis for the installation. So it was more difficult to assign those emissions to particular goods. But from now until 2025, I'm sure that all these will evolve. We will be better equipped than we are now, and we will be able also to possibly extend the scope of the in terms of sectors also to other sectors. In terms of emissions, as you will see in the proposal, there were a lot of discussions about direct, indirect emissions. Some of the sectors like the aluminium had concerns in particular with the methodology for assessing indirect emissions in third countries. For the moment, we have included direct emissions. Our intention, of course, is from now until 2025 to continue working on how to assess or how to have a robust methodology to assess indirect emissions in third countries. And I think that the collection of the information from 2023 will allow us to do that. This is, of course, linked to another measure in the EU at this moment to deal with the risk of carbon leakage, which is the indirect compensation cost for electricity. So we will be working on that, and we will assess by 2025 whether we already extend the scope also to cover indirect emissions from 2026. But for the moment, and I think that's something important that you will see, it's an interesting difference with respect to what we were discussing before, is that the scope for the moment is only direct emissions. So we go for a gradual phase-in, transitional phase in from 23 to 25, in which we will be collecting data from importers, in particular actual emissions, direct and indirect emissions, also the carbon price paid at the origin, and we want to know a bit more about their trade patterns. That together with the rest of the information we will get, of course, from the ETS, from the implementation of the ETS, we will be able to do the review by the end of 2025. And then from 2026, we will have what we call the post-transitional phase, or the full CBAM. The CBAM will be introduced gradually, in the sense that from 2026, there will be a reduction of the free allowances for the CBAM sectors. I have to say that there will be a reduction for all sectors, not only for the CBA sectors, but this is because of the ETS review. As you know, now we have an implementing act. I'm not sure now if it's an implementing or a delegated act that provides for the free allowances to the sectors at risk of carbon leakage until 2025. After that, there will be some sort of rebasing. There will be a new linear factor reduction. So there will be a revamp of the ETS in that sense, and that will be combined also with the gradual introduction of the CBAM during those 10 years. I suppose we will be criticized by some, maybe because they would like to have a higher impact of the CBAM from the beginning, but we thought that we found a balance that can be. Stop. Someone is talking. Okay, so I think we found a balance that can reassure the EU industry on one hand, and can also reassure the exporters in third countries on the other hand, because it gives time until 2025 to put into place all the necessary mechanisms to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the actual emissions. And also to the industry, it gives the industry a path and the certainty of where we are going at what level of rhythm we want to get there. Of course, the discussions will have to go in parallel in the Council, in the Parliament, on the review of the ETS and on the introduction of the CBAM. We will make sure with our colleagues in DG Clima, who are responsible of the ETS, to ensure the coherence between the two proposals. So, well, that's more or less in a snapshot how CBAM will work. From 23 to 25, it's a reporting period. So we will collect information on all emissions in third countries for the CBAM goods. And then from 26 to 35, as I said before, there will be a period of coexistence, cohabitation of the CBAM with a reduction of the free allowances. And therefore, the CBAM adjustment will apply to the difference between the real emissions in the third country. In my example, I assume that they are higher than in the European Union, and the emissions which are covered by free allocation in the EU ETS. As we move from 26 to 35, the free allowances will cover less and less free greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore also the adjustment of the CBAM, ceteris paribus, if third countries don't do anything, they don't reduce emissions, will also increase at the same time. From 2036, if third countries still emit or they don't have a carbon price which is the same as the one in the European Union, there will be a CBAM adjustment according to that gap. The interaction with ETS, I already referred to that. In the first phase, up to 2025, the CBAM will only collect information on actual emissions, so no full impact. Let's call it like that. And then from 2026, as we saw in the previous slide, the CBAM will reflect the difference between the real emissions or the actual emissions and the free allowances in the system. We have to allow for that because otherwise we will be discriminatory to imported goods. And as I said before, we have to be respectful of that principle. We try to put here on a slide the main obligations for the importers. So the system, as you will see when you read the proposal, relies first on the role of the customs authorities, who will be the ones who receive the goods initially. So they will have to check that the importers are registered. And at the same time, they will have, of course, to realize that there is an import of CBAM goods, and that information will have to be sent to the national climate authorities, who will be responsible of the rest of the package. As you can see, we have gone for a decentralized system. There were a lot of discussions between a centralized or a decentralized system. There are pros and cons, as you can imagine. In our impact assessment, we refer to that, but we propose to member states, and I hope it will be acceptable, that we go for a decentralized system by which the national authorities, the climate national authorities will be able to assess and collect the revenues from the mechanism. So there will be an obligation of registration, and then to buy the CBAM certificates. You will have, or they will have, the whole year to buy the certificates whenever they think it fits well with their intentions or with their business model. As you know, the price will be set weekly according to the price in the European Union. So we'll try to take an average of the different prices in every week in the different platforms. As you know, there are 3 different platforms at this moment in the European Union to auction the allowances, the ETS allowances. Then of course there will be a declaration of the goods. It will have to be done by 31st of May of the year after. This is similar to what we have in the ETS. In the ETS it's April. We gave an extra month in case importers or whoever who will be obliged to do that will be very busy also with the ETS. And then, of course, there will be an obligation to surrender the certificates according to the imports. They will be able to deduct the price paid at the source. And in case they have bought in excess, they can, of course, return some of the unused certificates. And the certificates will have a validity of 2 years. As you know, there won't be a parallel trade or secondary market for the CBAM certificates. We wanted to avoid complexities and possibilities of fraud or possibilities of alteration of the price. And we thought it was better not to have this parallel market. But then, of course, we give the opportunity to buy back some of the certificates that have not been used. We think that 2 years is also a sufficient period in order to use the certificates. International dimension is very important. I mean, I receive this question very often. We are engaging with the countries. We have already done it. And thanks also to Andre, because they have done a great job opening a window to countries like US, India, etc., in order to make the CBAM known as much as possible. I can tell you that we have already, now that we have the proposal already on the table and we know the details, we have already engaged more actively with our partners. All started, for example, in the finance meeting of the G20 in Venice 2 weeks ago. Well, on the 10th of July, 2 weeks ago. And the communique, for example, already referred to the importance of carbon pricing mechanisms. And I think that as they will be introducing more and more carbon pricing mechanisms, they will also be more and more concerned with the risk of carbon leakage. So that's why countries like Canada and Japan are already thinking about the introduction of a CBAM. And I can tell you that the US, for example, is also considering this possibility. I've been already in contact with the Australians last week. I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about the CBAM. Some of them, they still see this as a trade measure or a barrier to trade. I think it's going to be very important, of course, that we engage with them. Well, some will say to avoid retaliation. Yeah, okay, possibly. I think that as soon as they will know the details of the proposal, they will understand that there is nothing like that. But I think that what is more important is to find allies around the world, to also use the CBAM as a climate diplomacy tool, and also, of course, to ensure that the rest of the world will also team up with the European Union to reduce emissions. The regulation provides for agreements with third countries, in particular on setting carbon price paid at the source, as I said before. I also get a lot of questions about what happens with other regulatory measures. We know that the US will have difficulties in introducing carbon pricing measures, at least at federal level or for all the states. I mean, that's for the moment, and the regulation only takes into account the carbon pricing, because this is what we can use to compare with our ETS. In the EU, and that's what I tell everyone, I mean, in the EU, we have more than ETS. Some member states have, well, we have also the Energy Taxation Directive, for which I'm responsible as well, and which was reviewed also on the 14th, or the proposal on the review was also adopted on the 14th of July as part of the package. We also, or some member states also have carbon taxes. And on top of that, we have CO2 standards for cars, and we have other technology measures in order to reduce emissions. So it's difficult to compare one thing with another. We are comparing apples with pears, because one thing is a regulatory measure which introduces a cost, and I'm not going to deny that there is a cost, of course, but this is not a carbon price. So it's difficult to translate that cost into a carbon price. But as I said before, we are open to engage with the countries. For us, the most important now is to explain how the EU CBAM will work, and also to encourage them to introduce carbon pricing measures, or at least measures that will reduce effectively carbon emissions. And as they reduce carbon emissions, then the CBAM adjustment will be lower, or in any case, in the best case scenario, it will be zero. You will also see that we have foreseen an exclusion or a sort of limited white list for European countries, the ones which are part of the EU ETS, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland, and also Switzerland, because their ETS is linked to the EU ETS. And then we have also reference to the situation with the electricity market. There will be some coupling of the electricity markets with some neighboring countries, in particular with 6 Western Balkans, but it cannot be excluded that it will be extended to other countries. And we want also to recognize that situation. But as you will see also in the regulation, there will be some stringent and strict rules to apply by those countries in order to be able to benefit also from this exemption. In terms of countries affected, that's on the last slide. You can see which countries will be basically affected by that. Turkey, Russia, China, Norway will be exempted. These are in particular the countries which export most of the CBAM goods to the European Union. And then when it comes to electricity, it will be, of course, our closest neighboring countries, like Morocco, and then Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. So we want to engage with them very, very actively. We want to explain to them the measures and how they will apply. So that's in a nutshell the regulation which is already on the table. Now we are engaging also with the presidency of the council for this semester, the Slovenian presidency. I can tell you that they have set up a specific or ad hoc working group in the council with experts from different areas, such as trade, climate, customs, taxation, in order to discuss the proposal already from the 2nd of September. And then in the parliament, it will be the ENVI committee, which is chef de file. ITRE and ITA have asked to be associated. They still need to appoint the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteur, but we are already in close contact with them, so that as soon as they are ready, we will, of course, also engage with the European Parliament to start discussing the proposal. Ideally, we should have it adopted by the beginning of next year under the French presidency. So the Parliament and the ENVI committee in the Parliament and the chair is very committed, Pascal Canfin, to this proposal. And also the presidency of the council, they are very keen in making sure that this will be possible by the beginning of next year. And Andre, I think the best is that I stop here so that I can give time to everyone to intervene and to express their first reactions to the proposal. I will be happy and very eager to listen to your first comments. That's not the end, of course. We will have plenty of time to continue going into the details, and maybe I can go also more in depth through some of your questions. Thank you. Over to you, Andre.
The eternal phase, you're muted, Andre. Thank you, Vicente. Very appreciated. If you want to stop sharing the screen for a moment, that would be helpful. The way I see the hands up, and we take note of them, but what we would like to do, we'd like to kind of give the first right of intervention to the panelists, and then we see the hands coming up, and we are taking a note of them, we're keeping track of them, and we'll come back to them. So please do raise your hand. We do keep track of them. But I would like to take the bold step of actually sharing my own screen. This is I hope I can get it right, because it's always a nerve cracking type of exercise when you put this thing up, because you never know what's going to happen. Okay, I assume that you're seeing the right thing up. You see a full screen. It's last act before vacation, it worked. So now this is a presentation that says Andre Marcoux, but it's not true. It's a presentation that Michael Melling and Aaron Cosby and Andre Marcoux have worked together on, as we have worked on all the papers. For some reason, I think my colleagues here in Brussels got enthusiastic. I've only put my name in. I think we got a little bit flustered and I didn't have time to change that. So apologies to my colleagues, but it is a joint effort as always. So first of all, maybe not the right thing to do, but just very quickly remind ourselves in some of the previous work that we've done, some of the red lines that would identify, and one of them was indirect cost, indirect emission and cost, the relationship with export and fee allocation, and how do you accommodate foreign climate action, including national exemptions, allowing challenges of the default, and so on. So these are some of the things that we felt before this paper was unveiled that would be red lines. Now, where did we take us? Now, what we see as people challenging, or some of the things that will be never, we think will be brought up, is the no coverage over export. Yes, there is the pre-allocation, which we thought was a solution, but that pre-allocation is going to go on the sliding scale. So is this something that is going to satisfy domestic producers? There's going to be always the discussion that there's not enough protection through the CBAM. And internationally, we do see, as you have already mentioned, Vicente, no ability to credit for non-price foreign climate policies. Yes, we know there are European ones. My expectation is that there will be people challenging this in whatever way. And I also noted in my note here, it says, for the moment only carbon pricing. So either a second shoe to drop at some point in the future. Addressing indirect cost compensation, the need for international revenue sharing. I think that there has been a hope that some of this Cba revenue may go to those that pay in order to help with decarbonization. It looks that it's all staying in the EU. And diplomacy, we don't know where it's going to land, but we are going to virtually or physically going to Glasgow, and whether that is going to be raised in Glasgow as an issue of clashing with the spirit, bottom-up spirit of the Paris Agreement, it's something that time will tell. Now, some of the issues for discussion, we think that we've taken up by going through the text is, yes, you said it's obvious that these are the sectors. We understand some of them, most of them, a lot of them kind of relate very closely to the neighborhood. Some of them don't. The steel doesn't. How is the selection being made? Maybe there will be some discussion on that. The electricity special status, it looks like, and we estimate that the conditions are relatively soft conditions. The country agreements on carbon recognition, how will these negotiated and how would they work in practice? Now, the definition, how would this be done? The definition of declarant, importer versus operator facility installation. Is there a declarant and importer, and is there an aggregator that can play this role, or is it something that's going to have to be done by individual importers? If you think about the fact that you may have some very small operations, I mean, there is no de minimis provision for importers or declarants, and we found that a little bit maybe uneasy because in general, people import large quantities of raw materials or primary materials, but there are in some cases small importers, and they will be subject to this whole rigmarole. Now, definition of the system boundary of production process in Article 6.3, it's another question. there was an issue of an independent person verifying the carbon price in the country of origin. Kind of what is an independent person, but it may be a detail that could be sorted out. The relationship between the competent authority, the central administration, and the issuance of CBAM certificates. So you got a bunch of competent authorities selling CBAM certificates. The money goes for own resources, but somebody's going to have to administer the CBAM in national jurisdiction. How is that cost being defrayed? It may not be minor. In some cases, it could be important relative to the size of the country. Now, the surrender of certificate, we found that very interesting because we consider that it would be possible to hedge in the real ETS market in order to deal with the buying of certificates from this infinite pool. But if you're telling people that every quarter they have to have 80% of their allowance of their certificates in their account, there's no hedging possibility. So there's no trading, no hedging. Markets are in general, if this is a companion to a market, markets are generally put in place to do price discovery and hedge risk. So you're killing the hedging of the risk. And is this an intentional thing? The circumvention part, interesting also, it's only for the value chain and not the carbon content. That is probably alleviated by the non-inclusion of scope 2, but will this be reviewed in 2025 with the potential inclusion of scope 2 emissions? Some of the initial takeaways that we have from this proposal as ERCSD, and we spent a few good hours on Zoom over the weekend. It is the first concrete proposal on adjustment at the international border. There's the California, but there's the Interstate Commerce Clause. So it is really a credible effort, and it is really a historical moment. We think that the CBAM design takes a measured approach overall, adopts a deliberate time with positive implication for WTO compatibility, practical operationalization in terms of the UNFCCC process and sorting out other policy issues. So we do think that deliberate timeline is a positive approach. And the other thing is, it's a philosophical question. Not everybody among the three of us agree completely, but nevertheless, there is some writing on the wall. Is the interpretation of WTO changing to accommodate climate change? I think this is an anathema for the WTO enthusiasm and junkies, but me not being one, I do have to raise that issue. And finally, if you don't like this one, Vicente, you can tell them what do you want to do? I think that's a not illegitimate question to ask. So this is where I would stop. I just wanted to take you quickly through the things that we discovered. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to pass it on to Mike Melling and then to Aaron Cosby. So Michael, maybe you want to take it from here.
Sure, and thank you, Andre. And I'll keep it relatively short, but Vicente already mentioned, it's not only Europe that is thinking about BCAs, about border carbon adjustments, and indeed there's been some developments over the last week, coincidence or not, including a mention of a polluter import fee last week as the US $3.5 trillion budget was sort of presented. And then yesterday, a bill introduced by two members of Congress, a senator and a representative, setting out a border carbon adjustment. Now, like the EU, the US has been discussing the need for dealing with leakage in the context of climate policy and entertained the thought of using border adjustments. And in fact, I would say it was even a bit more favorable generally to doing so than the EU, where there was much more hesitation and caution about the trade implications, about the multilateral climate cooperation implications. Problem is the US never managed to get national climate legislation or a robust national climate policy underway. And so the need for a BCA was somewhat less pronounced. But you'll recall back in 2007, IBW and AP had this proposal that was then introduced as the International Reserve Allowance Program in pretty much every major climate bill. And since then, there have been a number of bills and also civil society proposals that include some form of BCA. But what has been common to all of those is that they would have accompanied a carbon price. And of course, as we know, looking at the politics and understanding the debate around carbon pricing in the US, it's all but certain that there will be a carbon price in the US as a main piece of federal climate policy. In fact, I think most people agree that it's not looking necessarily too promising, despite some glimmers of hope. And so what this bill that was introduced yesterday tries to do is to navigate that uncertainty. It is entirely agnostic as to the type of policy that would be introduced by the administration, President Biden and his team, and on Capitol Hill. And it keeps sort of the door open for different types of policies, which is quite unusual. And I think also raises a number of questions, of course, and that's why we thought it makes sense to very briefly describe what's in it. I have spoken with the authors of the bill, but I'm in no way representing or speaking for them is really my interpretation. If you look at the bill's text, which I believe should also now be available online, you see the sectors it focuses on are to some extent very similar to the CBAM, but it also includes hydrocarbons, so natural gas, petroleum, and coal. And it would start even a bit earlier with actual implementation. So not just the data collection phase, they really say January 2024. But what's interesting here is, again, since there is no federal carbon price and this bill does not presume that there will be, what it suggests instead is to try to calculate the average environmental costs incurred by domestic producers in a sector based on a number of different policies, such as the Clean Air Act, such as state cap and trade and carbon taxes, and some other policies, for instance, in the transportation sector. This is methodologically very, very challenging, of course. There's different ways to do that. I'm sure there will be many questions and also different views on how that should be done. We'll have to see. There is provisions about subsequent elaboration of methodologies in the bill. It does not state how exactly that will be done. It would also rely on the actual emissions of producers, so the production emissions for goods, and in the case of fossil fuels, on the upstream emissions associated with extraction, transportation, so of fossil fuels imported into the US. But it does also set out a benchmark like the EU CBAM in case that data is not available or not reliable enough, and which is a pretty stringent one. So it would apply a benchmark of the 1% worst performers, the most carbon intensive ones. Also interesting, and in contrast to the EU CBAM, which does credit foreign carbon pricing, this bill has no crediting provision at all for foreign policies. Instead, it would exempt countries altogether. First, the OECD's Development Assistance Cooperation LDC list, those are completely exempt. And then countries that are deemed, again, with no clear statement about the methodology, how to do that, to be at least as ambitious as the US in terms of their climate policies. But, and this is an interesting twist, such countries only if they do not impose a BCA on US products. And that provision does not, for instance, differentiate whether this foreign country that imposes a BCA rebates exports or not. So again, questions there. There's a few other things like a petition procedure for foreign producers to have their assumed carbon intensity checked and to appeal to that. There's a provision about international negotiations, and there's some provisions about revenue allocation. After deducting the cost for administering it, it would go half to the states and half to investments in various low carbon activities. Finally, I should also mention that there is sort of a value chain provision in there as well. It's not only the very upstream parts of these sectors like aluminum, cement, etc., but all the way down to where the goods traded still contain a minimum of 50% of, say, steel, iron and steel, etc. So I think that's very short, very much in a nutshell, but I'm sure that we may also want to reflect on that and what it means for sort of the continued debate about the EU CBAM and other BCAs. And over to Aaron, I believe.
Aaron, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm the token Canadian on our transatlantic collaborative team. So I'm going to bring you a little bit of a reaction from the Canadian perspective.
What do you mean a token Canadian? What do you think I am?
I guess. All right. Yes, I'm the token Canadian resident physically. So the Canadian context is informed by the fact that we also, like the EU, have a very ambitious climate regime in place. We will see we have a legislated carbon price going up to $170 Canadian per ton of carbon by 2030. That's about $130 US. And this is affected through an output-based pricing regime within big industry and a tax on fuel. This is a particularly ambitious agenda, and therefore, like the EU, we have been exploring the idea of border carbon adjustment although we are far behind the EU in terms of implementation. So for us, for Canadians, it's great to have a pioneer case that we can follow, emulate where it's appropriate, or adapt where it is not. We have, in the most recent Canadian budget, announced a consultative, pending formation of a consultative group on BCAs to try to explore what that looked like. In terms of design elements, from our perspective as a trading partner with the EU, it's nice to see credit for carbon pricing because we have carbon pricing. We don't expect our imports will be greatly impacted. It's nice to see the first option being actual GHG emission intensity, because we have a fairly decarbonized electricity grid, although indirect emissions are not included. We would have liked to see indirect emissions included. And this thing has sort of given us an advantage in the green markets of the future. But ultimately, as Canadians, we like to judge everything by through the filter of what happens to the south of our border with our largest trading partner. So I guess one way to sum up how we see the EU CBAM is that, in light of the proposal that Michael just discussed, it would seem to us that that proposal has almost been designed to make the EU proposal look good on the grounds of WTO legality, on the grounds of environmental effectiveness, on the grounds of fairness to trading partners. We find it, I'm not speaking on behalf of Canada, I should stop saying we. I find it to be a stark contrast to the measured approach adopted by the EU in its approach to CBAM in a number of respects, but that's a conversation for another webinar. I'll finish by talking about two of the broader questions that Andre raised. First on WTO law, and this is one where, as a team, we go back and forth. The question is WTO, the interpretation of WTO law changing? The law itself will not change. I think anybody familiar with trade policy will tell you that. The interpretation of the law changes over time. And those that interpret that law are sensitive to the realities of evolving international priorities, are sensitive to the fact that climate change is probably the biggest challenge we face, an existential challenge at the international level. So we can certainly see if a good effort is taken to respect WTO law, I expect we will see a strong desire on the part of those interpreting that law to find the measure in question in accordance with that law. I think that would be the case with the CBAM. I'm not going to comment on what I think would be the case with the US proposal. And finally, on the question of whether we see a conflict with the Paris Agreement, the spirit of the Paris Agreement in this EU CBAM proposal, personally, I don't. I think there are some design elements here which are helpful in terms of asking for actual data, in terms of a non-punitive default for GHG intensity. I would like to have seen revenue sharing affected to a much greater extent than I think it's going to be. But the ultimate question is, does it respect the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which says that those that have been most responsible for climate change in the past and those with the most means for addressing it should take a leadership position and should be out in front. It's been argued that this means that the EU should not be imposing the costs of its climate ambition on developing countries. That's true. And to the extent it's possible to alleviate that, I think through design elements that should be done. But it also means those countries in a leadership position should be taking leadership on mitigation. And in my view, the CBAM is an enabler of leadership. It's a prerequisite for leadership. You cannot have an ambitious climate agenda, and I speak here in terms of my perception of the EU and Canada. You cannot have an ambitious climate agenda without some means to attend to the problems of leakage and competitiveness impacts. I'll leave it at that, and we'll get to a more informed, broader discussion.
Thank you. So you now have the kind of the remarks for all three of us, and they all, including the presentation and the effort of all three of us. Now, David, thank you very much for stepping in at this, I would call it literally the last hour.
Indeed, the last hour. I hope you can hear me. And thanks a lot.
Yes, we can.
Thanks a lot for having me. I was asked to, given the role of the previous speaker, to step in for the transatlantic perspective. A lot of that has already been said, but I think it is safe to say still that the CBAM has visibly poked the bear here in the United States. in Washington D.C. And the respective proposals have already been mentioned. The polluter fee, the import polluter fee, as well as the Coons-Peters proposal that was made public yesterday. Both of those, and I think it's also fair to say that there's the discussion or the debate on the border adjustment as well as the carbon pricing is picking up, is intensifying, and CBAM has certainly contributed to that. Kerry has made very cautious statements in the beginning a couple of months ago. Now is much more in line with sort of having this kind of policy as part of the US policy portfolio as well. But we have, I mean, as Michael already summarized accurately, we have 6 carbon tax bills in Congress tabled right now, plus the 2 BCA proposals of last week and yesterday. And as for the latter, both would reference regulatory adjustment costs borne by US producers as a measure of adjustment, rather than the literal carbon price, such as a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme. And that really points at the number one important point for the US, and that is the relationship between non-pricing climate mitigation policies and border adjustments. Since the US is quite obviously quite carbon competitive, or in terms of its carbon intensity in respective sectors, almost where the EU producers are. And then the question is really, and Janet Yellen has posed a question, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, should a CBAM or a CBA not credit imports for the price equivalent or shadow price of non-pricing policies imposed by the exporting country? And that is certainly something that we will probably hear as the legislative process in the EU goes forward. We'll probably hear from the US side more often. And the sort of the mirrored question then for the carbon for the CBA in the US, the CBA discussion in the US, is whether regulatory requirements and standards can be border adjusted based on the carbon on a shadow price, and the question of how this could be done methodologically, rather complicated, but there are approaches to that, and but again, that would be part of another webinar. Or would the US already end up with a markup of net zero simply by submitting the recorded current producer emissions? That's or close to a markup of net zero. In any case, it seems that the CBAM would result in a competitive benefit for the US, not vis-a-vis the EU producers, of course, but vis-a-vis third country producers who are in a much worse position in terms of the markup that they would have to pay. I think what is also notable from the US perspective is the choice of not having export adjustments on the EU side, which is normally, at least sort of in the textbook literature, deemed as efficient in a CBA club setting. But perhaps that is so because export adjustments are not permissible for regulations under WTO laws, so that the EU perhaps has dodged a bullet. But in terms of whether CBAM can be sort of a guiding policy for other countries, for third countries, here's the question whether this choice has implications for the US policy design, and if not, does that have implications for a rising trade irritants between the US and the EU? A US carbon tax would likely see export adjustments. At least that is the debate, the state of the debate in the US right now. And for a carbon tax, we don't have the same legal constraints in WTO law. So for that matter, we would have export adjustments on one side, but not on the other. And does that create friction? Another point would be the use of CBA revenue. As was mentioned, the CBAM revenue stays within the EU, so far at least. On the US side, we've yesterday seen a proposal where the revenue would actually go to third country producers for decarbonization policies. And the question is really and this was perhaps on some of the more idealistic folks among us, important points that perhaps a transatlantic, that there could be a transatlantic initiative for greening of aid for trade, and whether this could still be possible in the process going forward. We have, of course, for the US is particularly important, the forum of negotiations, EU internal, at least, how can they vector their interests into the trilogue negotiations that are coming up, but also externally, to what extent, what is the role of different fora in CBAM with regard to CBAM discussions in terms of the high-level climate action group that was just formed by the US-EU summit in June. Is that a forum for CBAM discussions? Should Mexico, Canada, the UK be part of that? Is the G7 a better forum? Or what about the TESSD in the WTO, the Joint Statement Initiative, and as well as the MC12? Are those fora for the US to engage with the EU and other countries on equivalence agreements? And what is basically the best institutional choice here for the US to be made and for others to be made in order to come to mutually satisfactory solutions? And maybe just a last final point on the interpretation of or the changing interpretation of WTO law. I think listening to some of the more avant-garde WTO lawyers about 10 years ago, there was that notion, there was a lot of sort of optimism with regard to that question. I think that optimism is now a little bit more, people are a bit more on the cautious side. This discussion is particularly important, of course, for Article 3, for national treatment. And it seems so far that there has been very little movement on behalf of the WTO arbitrators to unpack Article 3 and to change the respective jurisprudence or case law into a direction that would be more amenable to proposals like the CBAM, the way that the CBAM is now structured. But I'll leave it with that, with these impressions from Washington, D.C.
David, thank you again for stepping in. Peter, you've been from the Ministry of Trade. Singapore has been one of the active participants in the discussion on WTO, but also you've been involved under UNFCCC in response measures where we've worked together for many years, topic not unrelated in many ways. What is the reaction in Singapore?
Thank you, Andre. Let me begin with a question. Might it be useful to develop a set of multilaterally agreed guidelines that would provide guidance on the application of CBAMs in the WTO and UNFCCC in a consistent manner, but at the same time meet the EU's objective of preventing carbon leakage to ensure effectiveness of climate policy? So might multilaterally agreed guidelines be helpful to meet the apparently competing objectives? So let me begin by firstly applauding the EU's climate mitigation efforts and its commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050. Certainly, all of us who are committed to the UN's multilateral process welcome the EU's commitment to this global effort. My presentation will be organized in three brief parts. Firstly, to set the context, I'll highlight how the principle of national circumstances must inform CBAM, as it should, regard to all aspects of the Paris Agreement. National circumstances matter. Second, I'll flag the economic and social implications inherent in CBAM. And third, and most importantly, I would propose some possible ways in which the potential adverse implication of CBAMs can be addressed. First point, national circumstances and mitigation efforts of parties must matter in the implementation of CBAMs. The Paris Agreement is founded on national circumstances. No one will quibble with that. Parties are required to take account of the national circumstances of other parties in the adoption of their mitigation actions. In short, parties adopting CBAMs like the EU must factor the situation of other parties. Let me briefly explain this point using the specific situation of Singapore. As all of you know, Singapore is a small island city-state, the size of Lake Geneva, 700 square kilometers. We import for all our needs. In the words of the convention, Article 4.10, Singapore is an alternative energy disadvantaged country. As an alternative energy disadvantaged country, Singapore faces constraints that makes it difficult for us to achieve the same targets as countries such as the European Union member states, which have abundant access to alternative energy sources. However, despite the geographical constraints and lack of alternative energy options, we have set ambitious stretch targets. As all of you know, Singapore submitted our enhanced 2030 NDC and long-term low-emission development strategy in March last year. Concurrently, we have launched various sustainable development initiatives. The Singapore Green Plan 2030 carbon tax. Our carbon tax covers 80% of global total emissions, one of the highest carbon tax coverage rates globally. Singapore is the first country in Southeast Asia to do so. Enhanced energy efficiency measures, phasing out of internal combustion engine vehicles, and last but not least, accelerated solar deployment. I highlight all these actions to make the point that the robust stretch mitigation targets of alternative energy disadvantaged countries such as Singapore, and of course other countries have other situations, must be factored by the EU as it designs and implements the CBAM. There's certainly no issue of carbon leakage as far as Singapore is concerned, given our robust stretch targets. My question to the EU, as the EU factored how it would take into account the mitigation efforts of other parties, including those with stretch targets such as Singapore. So that's a question to the EU. So that leads me to my second part of my presentation, a short one. We recognize the Convention and the Paris Agreement envisage the flexibility for parties to adopt measures to mitigate their climate mitigation commitments. This could include carbon tax. It is the prerogative of countries to decide for themselves whether they need a carbon tax. And it's also the prerogative of countries to decide for themselves whether they need a border carbon tax CBAM to ameliorate carbon leakage. So certainly it's the prerogative of the European Union to decide, and they have taken this step. However, we must not underestimate the potential economic and social implications of CBAMs. A Secretariat paper quite some time ago, 2009, highlighted that border tax adjustments could have the most impact on parties, including developing country parties. Notably, a recent UNCTAD paper, which I believe all of you would be familiar, as the following findings for ease of reference. Let me just quickly highlight some of the findings of the UNCTAD paper. Firstly, the introduction of carbon pricing coupled with CBAM helps reduce CO2 emissions. That's great. That's great news. However, the reduction represents only a small percentage of global CO2 emissions. Second, international trade patterns will change in favor of countries where production is relatively carbon efficient. So what about countries which are alternative energy disadvantaged, who not because of their willingness, but because of their inability to access renewable energy options, their production processes are not as efficient as countries in the EU which have renewable energy options. So wouldn't they be disadvantaged by virtue of their national circumstances? The third point, the CBAM will result in declines in exports in developing countries in favor of developed countries, which tends to have less intensive production processes. Last but not least, the UNCTAD highlighted that the EU should consider flanking policies. I won't go into that. I think that's an important point. So to sum up this section, this part of my points in this section, we understand that CBAMs might be permitted in the WTO subject to certain conditions. border carbon tax adjustments or border tax adjustments are permitted subject to certain conditions. However, I like to remind all of us who have been involved, and for those of us who have been involved in the WTO process, we know that even WTO permitted measures such as anti-dumping and safeguard measures, even if they were permitted, they have been abused in the WTO's history. So how can we be sure that CBAMs would not be abused? So this brings to my final and perhaps the most important part of my sharing. How can parties address the potential adverse implication of CBAM on their trading partners? As mentioned, parties need to consciously and systematically factor the national circumstances of other parties when they design their CBAMs. And I mentioned the specific example of alternate advantage countries such as Singapore. Second, parties must take into account partner countries' efforts at climate mitigation. For example, parties must factor the carbon taxation and pricing mechanisms of their trading partners. This is necessary to avoid imposing additional penalties and disincentives for climate action. Companies should not be taxed twice for the same unit of emissions. So that brings to my third point. Third, parties are required by Article 3.5 of the Convention to promote and keep an open trading system. So it's fundamental that as the EU implements the CBAM, they keep their borders open to trade and imports from other parties. As the convention says, economic growth and development is fundamental for countries to address the climate challenge. So that leads to my fourth point. Parties must ensure that both in the design and application of CBAMs, that those are consistent with relevant international rules in the WTO, such as non-discrimination. National treatment and MFN are two fundamental obligations. Of course, by no means these are the only ones. There are many other provisions in the WTO which relate to the CBAM, and is imperative that as the EU implements CBAM, that it adheres to all these obligations. Fifth, the role of carbon credits. Is there a role for carbon credits in this issue? The design of CBAM should allow for the use of environmentally integral carbon credits internationally through a well-regulated, transparent, and open trading platform. This will ensure that globally mitigation is undertaken in effective and emission-efficient manner. So there could be a role for carbon credits in the discussion on CBAMs as well. So let me conclude with the question I raised at the outset. So might it be useful to develop a set of multilaterally agreed guidelines that would provide guidance on the application of CBAMs in a WTO and UNFCCC consistent manner, but at the same time address the EU's objective of preventing carbon leakage to ensure effectiveness of climate policy? I think both are very important objectives. Open trading system, climate objectives, important, and we recognize there's a case for CBAM, but how can we reconcile these apparently contradictory policy objectives? Thank you very much, Andre.
Thanks, Peter. Let me go now through the last two, but not least, Susanna and Koen. Susanna, you want to go first, please?
Sure. Yes, thanks. Maybe I go back to where we started, and your team, or Andre, Aaron, and Michael have already laid out many points that I would share. I think what sticks out with the proposal now, after we have debated so much and anticipated so much, is it takes it really slowly and starts very, very carefully about the things we couldn't get our head around. For instance, the data collection issue. I feel that's a good idea. I feel that is good to have a transition phase that is actually a data collection phase from 2023 to 2025, which at some point might also increase the chances that it will get off the ground, because I think a partial introduction, even a partial introduction would have met with more resistance, but we will see that in the coming months when the discussion takes place on the legislative proposal and the next steps. I also think it does not fulfill the hopes for the revenues that were, calculated and anticipated, as it doesn't include indirect emissions. which is for some sectors a big chunk, especially for aluminum products, by the way, not sectors anymore. We're talking about products now. And of course, it has less bite when it comes to protecting against carbon leakage. And that is where the connection to the ETS comes in. And I reckon we still need some more time to fully understand what the dynamics will be when we compare numbers. So I'm at least not there yet. And I look forward to have other meetings to develop more on this kind of knowledge. I think also the proposal produces some really considerable leeway to changes and improvements. The choice now is to take products from 5 sectors, but not to include indirect emissions. One could have thought of taking 1 or 2 sectors and taking the full scope, but now we have a solution that goes into that direction, makes it a bit more tricky to understand the actual impacts. I know there's an impact assessment, I looked into it, but still, I think this will be learned on the go. I think free allocation that are, and this is a text of the proposal, are supposed to end. They have the critical role to play to make the CBAM acceptable, because they are the backup option for industries to get compensation on their carbon costs in times with a really dynamically increasing CO2 price in the EU. So I think that is my 2 cents to what we've heard already. I think in the foreign policy dimension, I'm still critical on the role of LDCs and the lack of a de minimis clause, which we have actually for the ETS and installations. Maybe there is a chance to talk about that in an early stage. Maybe the chances are that we will go there after a while in one of those phases after 3 years when there's an re-evaluation, after some learning about the data and the actual trade flows that are being affected. But I think that's important to keep that in mind. Aaron pointed that out as well. And I also see chances when it comes to interactions with partners that the times right now are rather times of where countries have an interest to follow the example instead of fending this off right away. And that is important for the EU because, as we said many times before, that you cannot go this alone when it gets real bite. And so I'm really expecting some more interesting discussions in that dimension too. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Kuhn, your cement has been traditionally supportive of CBAM. I mean, I always remember this was a Lafarge thing, but for many years ago, that's, whether it's true or not anymore now, I don't know, but that was the common with kind of common thought about 10 years ago. Where is cement come in? You're part of it. You're being proposed it to be part of it. Are you feel comfortable with the provisions? Does it address your concerns?
I mean, let me first of all say that, you always refer to the 10-year discussion on CBAM. We always surrounded it with a number of conditions, of course, so that's important to say. Lafarge Holcim being Holcim right now as well, so the change of name. Let me first of all say that the CBAM proposal, we also look at it in combination with all the other initiatives that have been taken in the Fit for 55 package. And I think it's important to say that here, that the Commission needs to be commended for putting forward a package which is really a package that looks at the objective of the European Union by 2050 and intermediate by 2030. I think it's a Herculean task. We might not agree with everything that is in there, and I will expand on that in a second, but I think to put a package together like this one, it's something that is an achievement. And Vicente has put together ETD and CBAM. Congratulations for that, because this is a huge job. You compared it to a mother-child birth. I'm not sure I would repeat that in your wife's presence, because she will say that you never felt that pain. But I think it's important that that has been put forward. I mean, it gives us something to work on. It gives us something to constructively cooperate on. You won't be surprised that, yes, we do have a number of issues with the package as it stands now, and especially CBAM specifically, when I would say that Issues that we are worried about, yes, till 2025, there will be no CBAM. At the same time, the imports are increasing pretty substantially. Imports not only increasing, but also business models that are changing. Third country importers that are changing their business models. In our case, that means that the clinker production is done outside of the EU, which is the most CO2 intensive part of the production, and the grinding is done in the European Union, which means that you have an immediate impact on the European market till 2025, where basically there is no CBAM applying. From 2026 onwards, yes, there is a CBAM applying, but we still have a 10% reduction of our free allowances, which means by 2030, we will have a 50% reduction of our free allowances. I think that has an impact in terms of not only competitiveness internationally, but competitiveness in the European Union. And if you look at the increase of costs, our cost base is increasing, also compared to sectors that would not be in the CBAM and would still be subject to ETS. I mean, Vicente briefly discussed that, but I think it's a point that needs to be taken in consideration. Of course, we are disappointed about the exclusion of indirect costs. I understand the rationale. I understand what is behind it. I also know that it's going to be revised in 2025. But I do think that it's very important to take into account that the decarbonization in all of our industries is going to go at par with an increased electricity demand. We're going to have increased electricity needs. When I'm looking to carbon capture technology, which is making up for 42% of our emission reductions by 2050 in our sector, I mean, we need between 50 and 120% more electricity. So to then exclude indirect costs, and then I'm not only talking about CBAM, but we have other parts of state aid legislation where that is excluded for us, that is again put us at a competitive disadvantage, and we are disappointed that this is indeed excluded at this stage. And of course, also the export rebates. I think for exports, I understand the issues in terms of WTO compatibility, but let's have the discussion at least. I myself, being a lawyer, I always think that there are two sides to the argument. So I do think that we can have an argument about a design of an export system which allows WTO compatibility. I think it's something that deserves further discussion and on which we are somewhat disappointed. Now, I think the advantage of the proposal, and there I come to the positive sides, I think the advantage of the proposal is that it is transparent in the sense that, for instance, if I'm looking at third country systems, either you have an ETS system and then you end up into the Annex 2, which just means that you're exempted, or you have a CO2 price, which is then taken into account in the way that the CBAM certificate, the CBAM level is being adapted. That gives, I think, a certain level of security and a certain level of previsibility towards third parties. So I think that's positive. I also think that there is a lot of clarity on the legal basis. I mean, it's clearly a legal basis based on the environment, Article 192 of the treaty. I think that gives the advantage of saying our prime objective is environment. And I think that also means that in WTO discussions, you have an easier discussion on that. Article 2 and 3 of the GATT will be complied with. But if not, you have the environmental exception on Article 20, which will indeed be facilitated by presenting it as an internal regulation, not necessarily as a tax, as an internal regulation, which is mirroring the ETS system. And there again, I think mirroring the ETS system means that you're applying the same rules. So comparable cost basis, taking into account free allowances for European operators in calculating the charge by third country importers. So I think that's pretty logical. I think, as been said before, there are a lot of delegated acts to be adopted. Vicente said it himself. So a lot of details will still need to be elaborated. And in that regard, I think consistency and coherence are important. To give you an example, and as Vicente said as well, the CBAM gives one rule in terms of surrendering allowances, taking into account the level of free allowances, but then the free allowances discussion is part of the ETS directive. So we need to make sure that that is aligned, that these discussions are happening in parallel. also in the Council, in European Parliament, where maybe there are several committees, several rapporteurs being responsible. So we need to make sure that in the whole exercise going forward, that we ensure the consistency of the measures that are adopted. And I think it's an important concern that we have, and I think it's something that more sectors will share. But I will stop there, André, with my comments.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've heard quite extensive comments. I'd like to, in order to start a discussion, before I elicit, if you want, reactions from those that are panelists, including Vicente. I'll go to Patrick De Decker first, because he has his hand up for a long time, and I think that will give us a little bit of the audience. So Patrick, are you there? Hi, Patrick.
Yep, I'm there. Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Vicente, and the Commission for this proposal. As Koen said, we're not agreeing with everything, but at least it's a good starting point, and will be interesting to see the rest of the discussions. So we share the concerns about the late introduction, the absence of scope 2, the absence of export rebates, but as I said, that looks like a good starting point. I have two questions. One is procedural. The Commission has launched a new set of consultations, open until the 9th of September. And I was just wondering where to situate those consultations. Do they make any sense? Will they be taken into account? Given that before the synthesis is made by the Commission, the Parliament will have started work on the existing text. So where do you situate that consultation in the process? Second one, none of our products is in the current proposal. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself, Patrick De Decker from Total Energies. So we're busy in oil and gas, refining, chemicals, alternative energies, whatever. With the late and slow introduction, my first impression was that the second train might only leave the station around 2030 for those sectors not yet on board. So I was pretty happy to hear that you consider the possibility that in 2025, the scope of sectors could already be revised. My question there is, how do you see that? Does that mean that sectors that come on board in that year skip the 3-year trial period and immediately go to the application? Or do they get on board with a 3-year delay versus the first wagon? Thank you.
Thanks. Anna, I also give the floor to Anna. Anna Gumbau, she's from Carbon Pulse. Anna, let's try and keep the question very short, please.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Andre. So I have two, hopefully very quick questions. First of all, is for Vicente Hurtado. And I wanted to ask about, well, if you could clarify what's going to be the state of Northern Ireland when it comes to the application of CBAM. Like, is it going to be applying for Northern Ireland for non-power exports? What's the state of that? And the second question, I actually wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, Andre, at another panel last week, which is that the way that the CBAM proposal looks like, it seems to be affecting more the EU's most immediate neighbors rather than global trade partners. I found the question very interesting, so I just wanted to bring it up to the panel and perhaps briefly discuss that. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. I'm going to the panelists. Anybody wants to, react to the other comments? Vicente, you may have a field day with all this. I don't know, I mean, to ask you to react to every question and that everybody is raised in this, I think it'll be fascinating, but it may be taking a lot more time than we have allocated, even though we're willing to stay along, longer than scheduled. But who wants to take the lead and react? Again, I don't want this to become a bilateral and put Vicente on the spot. You are nevertheless, I think they're looking at you. Susanna, you started to say. Go ahead.
Maybe just to react to Anna's question about the neighbors of the EU. Yes, sure. I mean, this is basic materials and electricity, and the basic materials that are included are the majority is not traveling long distance because there's a trade-off, of course, with transportation costs and being close to markets. And then electricity, there's a long list of conditions in the proposal, how to take them into account due to the energy union and the transmission of energy and the costs that actually determine the market, so the merit order and so on and so forth. So a very special product. And if you look into the numbers, which I did in an extra study that I didn't present, but yet, of course, it's a handful of EU neighbors affected. And if you look at the steel sector, not according to the product that are listed now, but to the sector NICE code, then you will see that the US ranks in place number 16 and 15 when it comes to trade values and volumes. And we do not know how much this will all add up to, but definitely the negotiations and the key players that will come to the table are those countries that are the neighbors to the east of the EU and to the south, and maybe UK if they do not feel like linking their ETS to the EU. We will see that, what's going to happen to that. But of course, the UK is also a key trade partner. So we're not talking in all respects about China, but of course, China comes up when we look into the aluminum trade or steel trade. But yes, it's a handful of EU neighbors plus a handful of countries for fertilizers, for instance, that are rather poor, and a very few number of countries is far distant countries. So the diplomatic challenge is, of course, how to address those partners and look for the forums where to talk to them about the implications that are at the horizon, because at the moment we won't see a high impact.
Thanks, Susanna. Anyone else wants to jump in at this point? Or everybody's beating their
maybe
time?
Andre, I can say a few words because there were some direct questions to me. I mean, thanks a lot for the discussion. I mean, it's very helpful always for me to listen to experts in the area, and you never stop learning. That's clear. As I said before, this is not the end of the road. Okay, we came with a proposal, so we have something on the table, and then of course any discussions will feed into the discussions between the two institutions, the Parliament and the Council, and I'm sure that there will be a way or another to make sure that any consultation, and that's the reply to Patrick, any consultation will feed into the discussions, of course, at interinstitutional level. Patrick, you also asked if we extend, for example, in 2026 to oil, gas, chemicals, 3 years delay or 3 years transitional period. Not necessarily. I mean, the idea would be, of course, to apply the measure directly from the beginning. No need to go to this pre-warming up session before, of course, applying the CBAM. Anna had a question about Northern Ireland. Yeah, that's a tricky issue, as you know, but I mean, as in general for Northern Ireland, of course, the objective is not to impose a new border on goods coming from Northern Ireland to Ireland or to the rest of the European Union. That's not the sole or the objective of the negotiations with the UK or Northern Ireland. But what is clear is that we will have to sit down with our neighbor, with the UK, and to discuss maybe to modify the protocol or the annex to the protocol in order to make sure that there will be a control of the goods that come to Northern Ireland or to the rest of the UK, and then make their way to the rest of the European Union. And also, I suppose that the UK will be very much interested in discussing with us about measures, recognition. I understand that the UK is also considering maybe a CBAM in the future. So for sure that the discussions with one of our main neighbors or our main trade neighbor will be for sure granted. Then other issues, I mean, many questions. You raised a long list of points. Most of them will be, of course, part of the delegated and implemented acts that we have to develop. So I think it's a bit early to go into the details. You mentioned, for example, and someone else mentioned the issue of a no de minimis rule. We thought about that. We know in the DTS there is a de minimis rule for installations, but as I said also in my intervention, we are not targeting installations, we are targeting goods, so it's a bit trickier for us. We thought that introducing a de minimis rule would be a possibility also for circumvention. That would be more difficult for us to control. And in any case, from our analysis, and you will see in the impact assessment, I can't remember the percentage, but a very high percentage of the importers or the exporters into the EU are big exporters. If you introduce a de minimis rule, be sure that they will try to use that, and that's exactly what we wanted to avoid. You refer to circumvention. Yeah, I know there are limits to what we can do with circumvention. We hope to catch most of the possibilities through the article on circumvention, but also to the default values, and also why or the conditions by which you can apply the actual emissions. You will see that for the electricity is very different from the rest of the sectors. There we rely on default values, and then if you want to go for real emissions, you need to comply with a list of criteria which are in the annex. So, I mean, we will try to see that. We also have the transitional period from 2023 to look at that more in depth. So that's something, of course, that it's very important for the credibility of the measure, and that we will have a clear, a look at it very carefully. I would like to thank Michael for the presentation of the US bill. I found it very interesting to see the links with our proposal, and also where there is a deviation from our proposal. That's also a point for David. I mean, we want, of course, we want to keep very good relationships with the US. Yele has been discussing with our commissioner, also with my director general. I understand that there is a big interest in the US on the CBAM and also on their own CBAM. So we will try to see what are the points of link between the two proposals. The starting point is very different because we have an ETS, they don't have any carbon pricing, and they won't have any carbon pricing. So there will be some work to be done, but I'm sure that there will be a space for discussions for a transatlantic relationship, of course, with those who are like-minded. The same with Canada, Aaron. I mean, yeah, we know that Canada is one of the best allies, so we want to work with them, and we are, of course, in close contact with their authorities. Koen, thanks a lot for the views of one of the sectors under the CBAM. We will have chances to discuss in bilateral more carefully. So I took note of your main concerns. The export rebate, we will discuss it at long length, as you can imagine. The experts on WTO legal aspects, they have big concerns about their compliance with WTO. I may have my personal views, as you know, we have discussed that, but okay, that's the reality. But I'm sure, I mean, I would not be surprised that this comes back to the discussions in the council, because I'm sure that some member states will be well debriefed, lobbied by the industry, and I'm sure that the issue will come back to the discussions again. So I will be pleased to listen to other experts, to the views of member states, and let's see how the discussion evolves. But I mean, if we didn't put it in the regulation, it's because we have concerns. Okay, but yeah, okay. Nothing is completely written on stone for the perpetuity. So let's see. And I'm sure that I didn't cover many things, but I'm sure that Andre will take the opportunities in the future to do some regular follow-ups and updates on the discussions between the Parliament and the Council, and I will be pleased to come and talk to you about these things. Thanks, Susan, also for your first reactions and criticisms. I'm happy to discuss. Okay, let's see. The beauty of the interinstitutional framework is that all the proposals can be improved by the Parliament and by the Council. And my experience, because I've been working I was Mertens and Antici for a long time, so I've been working in the Coreper and in Council for 6 years. So I know that the interinstitutional agreement, in most of the cases, helps to improve the legal text.
Thank you, Vicente. Anyone else wants to come in? Michael, Aaron, you guys want to react to any of this? If not, I'll go to Sergei Borisov. But while he's getting on the panel, anyone wants to react in any way? If not, Sergei, are you there? Have you made it to the panel? I don't know, Sergei. No. Okay, so
yes, sorry for the interruption. Yes,
okay, if you want to introduce yourself, Sergei, please.
My name is Sergey Borisov. I am a student from Moscow State University, and thank you, dear participants, for such a brilliant discussion over the topic. And I have a question probably to anyone who wants to talk about that. So the CBAM includes not only primary steel and aluminum products, but also secondary steel and aluminum products, such as steel rails and pipes or aluminum foil. And how does this relate to the ETS? Is the production of these goods included in the current phase of the ETS? Thanks.
Thank you. Angela, also Angela Friedrich. Angela, you make it from on the panel?
Hello, you hear me?
Yes,
okay?
hi, Anne.
Okay.
Yes,
well,
we can hear you.
Andre,
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Angela Friedrich from Austria, from the Ministry of Environment. And thanks, Andre, for convening this webinar. And actually, I do have a question for Vicente. First of all, thanks for the excellent presentation. And in looking at your presentation in this slide of phasing in and phasing out the free allocation and phasing in CBAM, I was wondering how to make sure that this fits together, because as you said, the ETS is on installation level, and then the CBAM is on goods. And if you reduce the free allocation 10% on the installation level, how would you do that with the goods? Thanks a lot.
Any reaction? Any other reaction? I think Vicente, and you know, whether we like it or not, you got to suffer through this another 15-20 minutes. It's okay. I mean, at the end, summer is coming, and we're not bad people. But listen, one thing that was brought up, and I would be interested. I personally also would be interested to this new consultation that is taking place. What is it, and how does it fit in this whole thing? We've also seen I think some kind of a tender out for a impact assessment on the neighborhood, I think it was. So there's a couple of things that are happening in parallel with the process, and I think they will be important for many to understand how they fit in one way or another.
I mean, actually, I don't know exactly what Patrick was referring to, because I haven't launched, we haven't launched any specific consultation. I suppose he refers to the statutory general consultation, which comes whenever we publish a proposal, and then there is the possibility to react to the proposal. But I mean, there is nothing structured as such by us, like the consultations that we did in the preparation of the impact assessment or the legislative proposal. But maybe Patrick can confirm, because he also mentioned the deadline, so 9th of September. So maybe he can confirm that. So
yes, I can confirm. It looks like for every piece of the Fit for 55 package that more or less automatically a consultation is reopened for, what is it, 8 weeks, I think.
Yeah. That perfect. Thank you, Patrick. Is what I thought. I mean, it's the general period of consultation, or yes, reactions rather than consultation, because the proposal has been adopted. So we are not changing the proposal, but it's the possibility to get reactions to the proposal by citizens and stakeholders. Then there was a question from Sergey on the goods. Yes, they are part of the ETS. So as I said, we are mirroring the ETS as much as possible. So also in terms of scope, when it comes to goods. Angela, thanks a lot for your question. It's a tricky technical question. We are in contact with our colleagues in DG Clima how to assess the emissions covered and not covered by the free allowances and by the rest, and then we will translate that into the goods. There will have to be some sort of logarithm or formula that we will do, because we will need to inform the importers of the part of the benchmark that corresponds to the certificate that they don't need to buy in order to comply with the CBAM regulation. So we will do that translation, and we will make sure that there is no, as much perfect as it can be, to make sure that there is no discrimination for importers.
Mike, Aaron, you guys have been quiet after initial intervention. Any reaction from you to any of these things? I don't want to put you on the spot. I've been happy to continue to ask the other panelists or go to there's still a long line of questions. There's Konstantin Von, who I think that there's a point where we don't know all the interveners, and we would ask them to introduce themselves. So Konstantin, if you want to introduce yourself, please. Okay. I don't hear Konstantin. So maybe he was a mistake.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Are you there? Yeah, we can hear you, yes.
Oh, great. I'm Konstantin Kvon. I work in a Petromarket Russian consultant firm, and I have a question about CBAM compatibility with other countries' carbon policy. My particular question is if some country introduce their own carbon tax on export, only export, but to all countries, not just EU. Will exporters from that country be able to claim a reduction in number of EU CBAM certificates to be surrendered? Is it legal to pay only for export of goods? Because, well, in Russia, our population is, well, can't withstand higher prices on products. So if we can start with only export, it will be much easier for Russia to introduce some carbon policies. Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, that's a question that comes to mind, and I'm referring to Vicente, but to everybody else. I mean, it's kind of a truism, and I mean, why, if anybody that exports and knows that's going to be taxed, I'm from country X, I'm exporting, so some guy that exports, I don't know, aluminum, cement, steel, whatever they export, and I'm only going to pay to the European Union, I might as well tax them at home. Why would you think you're going to get a single penny out of them? So that is, I'm a little bit puzzled out of the 9 billion or whatever number it is, because my expectation is, unless somebody is asleep at a switch, I would expect that you'll get nothing.
Andre, if I understood what Kwon was referring to is that you only introduce, for example, in Russia, carbon tax, but only for the exports to the EU, because there is a CBAM to make sure that the money stays in Russia. I mean, it would be unfortunate that they only introduce the measure for the exports only to make sure that the money stays in Russia, and not because they really want to decarbonize the country. But maybe we will have to think about that, whether we should take this into account or not. Okay, no, I mean, the idea, of course, is that we would take that into account, but I mean, I would find it a missed opportunity.
Could you seem to?
And maybe an incentive not to export.
Well, I just wanted to, I mean, I'm not sure that I fully got the question, but I think if you only tax the exports, that means that, I mean, the full carbon costs will basically be borne by European operators. And then the importers, they will be able to spread the carbon cost amongst their operations locally or domestically. They will not have any incentive to reduce their emissions, and they will export from their only export plants. So, I mean, I think it doesn't really provide for a equalization of costs there. So I think that's an issue.
Yeah, sorry, Susanna?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is not a new idea. I mean, the US managed in the 80s, I think, to put pressure on Japan to introduce something like that, like an own taxation on, I can't recall the details, but that was the same strategic and pressurizing kind of policy to make a country move to put a restriction somehow on their own exports. In this case, we have already seen that, I think, end of the beginning of the first decade of the new millennium, when China tried to keep materials within China, and they phased out their VAT rebates, they put export charges, and this added up to 30 euros per ton of CO2 that was incorporated in those materials. So it is not uncommon to do that. Whether or not the EU will trigger this kind of rethinking, just because we are talking for some countries about quite high numbers, we will see. We will see. There is, of course, some kind of interest now in CO2 pricing in those countries that are already considering it, like maybe Turkey, maybe Russia. Whether or not they will install it the way we are just discussing it right now, I don't know, because it takes some time to put things in place. So if it's a pure customs duty, whatever export measure, or whether or not it's rather a fiscal program or about taxation, these are different time spans and cannot be put in place that easy in an easy fashion. But I wonder what we will see coming up. Well, but of course, that's what Kuhn said is true. It is not at all a measure to reduce or to put production costs, to increase production costs according to CO2 content. It's rather a measure of fiscal ambition and of international reactions to something that creates revenues.
Thomas Green.
Hi, thank you.
Somewhere there. Hi, Thomas. If you want to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. My name is Thomas Green. I work as a policy analyst at the Energy Futures Initiative, which is a DC-based think tank. My question is, the US is considering a clean energy standard as part of its climate policy. And I was wondering if you could comment on, would a clean energy standard where you have a payment or something for energy, could that be considered a carbon price under the CBAM framework? And what else should the US consider as it designs its climate policy as the EU develops its CBAM? Thank you.
Inevitable question. I think that we all know. Michael, Aaron, Susanne, Vicente, anybody wants to react to that?
No, Vicente, of course, wrote the part, but I believe the CBAM regulation proposal has a definition of what's understood as a carbon price that can be credited under Article 9. And it says specifically carbon tax or emissions trading system. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think a federal clean energy standard, although it could reveal a price if there's trading, if it's a tradable performance standard, would still probably not qualify, no? But this is maybe one of the things that can be discussed.
Yeah, Michael got it right. I mean, that's the idea. But we also have the possibility for discussing, for signing agreements, international bilateral agreements to discuss how to assess the carbon pricing. So I would never say categorically no, but the idea is that, of course, if the US introduces this act or the US applies this act and this has a positive impact on reducing emissions, that will be taken into account in the way we apply CBAM, for sure. So there are two ways. One could say, okay, we are exempted because we apply this and this is equivalent to your measure. Or the other possibility is to say, as soon as you are successful with your measure, the emissions will be reduced, and therefore in one way or another, that's taken into account in the CBAM, because we take into account the carbon price, but also the actual emissions.
Because right now there is no provision, and the only provision is on strict carbon pricing. But I think that, as you said, things get improved sometime in going through the trialogue process. Susanna, did you want to come in on something? Or no, I know that was my wrong impression. Anyone else that wants to react to this? I think, yeah, Aaron, please.
Just quickly, two thoughts to add to what's already been said, with which I agree. One is that if we countenance a CBAM that does take into account in the context of the bilateral negotiations, non-tax, non-ETS policies for one country, it opens a can of worms, and then we have to try to sort out which non-price-based climate policies we will and will not account for from other countries. I think it's highly unlikely that the EU would like to open that can of worms, number one. The second thought is that I've seen a bunch of analyses of the US economy and decarbonization pathways going forward that actually calculate cost savings from a clean energy standard for producers, a lowering of the cost of electricity, just based on the low levelized cost of energy involved with clean electricity sources relative to the more conventional generating sources. So it's not clear how much cost we're actually talking about here.
Yes, I think Aaron made it very clear. I mean, Andre, if you allow me, I mean, Aaron made it very clear. I mean, it's difficult to translate cost into price. And I mean, in one way or another, you need mathematics in order to be able to apply a system which is as neutral as possible. And then let's not forget also the most favored nation clause in the WTO, in the GATT articles. If you allow one country, for whatever reasons, whatever technology or whatever provision to be considered as sufficient to be exempted from the CBAM, then you will have the same problem with the rest of the world. I mean, the rest of the countries will be applying or asking for the same treatment, and you never have two regulations the same in different countries. So that's a very tricky issue. Unfortunately, it becomes more difficult.
Okay, well, I'm trying to look through some of the other questions. I assume a classic one is the fact that in 2025, 26, you're going to have a review. The one thing I learned, I remember the first review when I was running an organization, the first review, the board came in and said, do we still lead this organization? And I said, you guys just hired me, what are you talking about? So there's also the possibility, I would imagine, that in 2025, 26, given the fact that we go through a Paris Agreement stock take, whether the EU will evaluate whether this is still a necessity or everybody, they're all brother in arms now, and none of this will be necessary. Because it is as a result of asymmetrical climate policies. Or that would be my interpretation. That's always an open question. We heard the vice president also say that we hope that we don't need it because it's hopefully people do the right thing. So we'll watch with great attention the negotiation and the discussion, the G20, the G7, the UNFCCC. Aaron, you look skeptical.
I share your idealistic optimism that we may see a future in which the CBAM is not necessary, and I hope fervently that it comes to pass.
Thank you very much. Cool, do you share that optimism?
No, I mean, I think what you're saying is probably, yes, something that can be done, but don't forget that all of our industries, I mean, we have had the ETS, which was adopted in 2018 for phase 4. That is now being changed during phase 4. If you're now going to say, CBAM, but maybe in 2025, 26, we're going to have second thoughts about it. I mean, what does that do to legal certainty and previsibility of industry? I mean, we have long-term investment cycles. We need to decarbonize by 2050. These are huge investments, and companies are making these decisions today, and they're making these decisions against the framework of legal certainty. And if we are subject to maybe, maybe not, I think that is really bad for industry. I'm sorry to be a little bit negative, but I'm concerned by this because this is what we always hear about industry. Give us legal certainty.
Okay, look, we have a few minutes left, and what I'd like to close with kind of a question is, what do you think, what is going to be the most hotly debated issue in this? I'm not sure, Vicente, you want to answer this, but for the other people on the panel, including Peter, who's been quiet, I don't think he's asleep in Singapore yet, but he's been quiet. But what do you think is going to be the most hotly debated issue in the CBAM? I mean, we're going to go through the trialogue, and there's going to be people lobbying right, left, and center, and for both business and NGOs and everybody that you care to name. So, Aaron, if I were to ask you, what do you think is going to be like the highlight of this whole thing? What is the spotlight?
It's well, I'm afraid it may be really boring issues like the relationship between the central authority and the competent authorities, at the use of revenues, the share of revenues devoted to own resources, and those revenues devoted to multilateral ends, this kind of thing. On the fundamental principles of on the fundamental design elements of the proposal, I have a hard time seeing many of them change. I think the proposal gets it right. It's a politically workable, measured solution. I'm probably wrong on this, but I don't see much room for controversy on those elements.
You see, Vincent, you have a fan in British Columbia. Michael?
Well, I agree with Aaron. I think largely, I think personally that exports will bubble up with the way that the proposed regulation, it buys a lot of time, which I think is hugely important. But free allocation will decline, and by the late 20s, there's going to be a serious question about that. So I don't think necessarily that the proposal will have to respond to that, but I think there will have to be a discussion about what complementary measures can potentially help, catch this challenge, which WTO law won't easily make go away. It perhaps cannot be solved with the CBAM. It has to be solved elsewhere. And so Andre, you'll applaud. I'll happily shout out that the last paper in this year's project is going to be about the instrument mix complementing the CBAM, no?
You have to do the 15 seconds commercial, no? Susanne, what do you think? Where is the spotlight going to be? I mean, there's always one topic at the end.
Oh, I think my general take is that we will now develop an idea of how the whole tool set is going to work and interact, and where we have to adjust not only the CBAM proposal, but also the others. So I'm expecting some interesting talks coming up in the late part of this year, and also at the national levels across member states. So I think we're not done yet. Yeah, but that will be interesting, and I look forward to it. So that's my take at the moment.
Good.
I fully agree with Suzanne. I think there is a lot of discussion that will go into how to put together the different pieces of the jigsaw. We're going to have a good discussion about export treatments. I think that's for sure.
And Peter, I don't. You wanna jump in from Singapore again? You're very much into the international negotiation, WTO and FCCC. What do you think this is going to kind of pop up?
Well,
you're going to bring it up. What are you going to make my life miserable?
Well, no. But we need to accept that border carbon tax adjustment is a lightning rod. It has been. It will be. So the challenge that we have both in the UNFCCC and the WTO is for both the trade and climate communities to come together. The starting point is that CBAM is used to prevent carbon leakage. Why are we preventing carbon leakage? So that countries can take ambitious measures to mitigate climate change. So the entry point will be, how can we reconcile the Paris objectives and WTO rules? I think that's where the conversation need to take place. And it's in that spirit that I raised the question, might it be useful to develop a sort of a reference point, a multilateral set of guidelines that can help to mitigate the concern about abuse, but at the same time, providing the comfort for countries like states like the European Union to use CBAM so that they can improve climate ambition, which is beneficial for all of us. Thanks, Andre.
Vicente, I know you have to run. Any last words except have a nice summer? Anything else?
No, thanks a lot for the discussion, the great discussion today, and we will keep in touch. I take note of all your comments, and that will of course feed into the discussions in the coming months. Okay, thank you. I have to leave. Sorry.
Thank you, Vicente. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. And apologies, there are a few people that I have raised their hands, but I knew that Vicente had to go, so I could not extend this any further. So I apologize to those that didn't get the floor. But what I can promise you that we'll be back, and we'll be back in the fall. I think we have a full program, and CBAM is not a minor part of that, all I can tell you. So anyway, again, thank you all for taking the time in the late summer. I still have a few CBAM engagements over the next few days, but I will keep in touch with all of you, and I'll see you at the rentrée, as they say, somewhere south of here. Thank you. Have a nice summer.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.